Hello everyone and welcome to our new video today. We'll discuss the ESP. We will kick off with introduction to ESP. First of all, we should learn some necessary words like the following: savage, uncivilized, barbarous. For example, savage tribes. Prospect, an apparent probability of advancement, success, profit, etc. Rosy, cheerful or optimistic. For example, rosy anticipations. Frontier, the part of a country that borders another country. Boundary, border. Allegiance, the loyalty of a citizen to his or her government, or of a subject to his or her sovereign. Materialize, to come into perceptible existence, appear, become actual or real, be realized or carried out. For example, our plans never materialized. Gloomy, hopeless or despairing. Pessimistic, a gloomy view of the future. Pitfalls, a lightly covered and unnoticeable pit prepared as a trap for people or animals. Itinerary, a detailed plan for a journey, especially a list of places to visit. Plan of travel. Scant, barely sufficient in amount or quantity, not abundant, almost inadequate. For example, to do scant justice. Entail, to cause or involve by necessity or as a consequence. For example, a loss entailing to regret, a loss entailing no regret. Herald, to indicate or signal the coming of, usher in. Unprecedented, without previous instance, never before known or experienced, unexampled or unparalleled. For example, an unprecedented event. Currency, something that is used as a medium of exchange, money. Justification, a reason, fact, circumstance, or explanation that justifies or defends. For example, his insulting you was ample justification for you to leave the party. exert, exert, to put force or into use, as power, exercise, as ability, or influence put into vigorous action. For example, to exert every effort. Stroll, stroll, a leisurely walk, ramble, saunter. For example, a short stroll before supper. Monolith, monolith, something having a uniform, massive, redoubtable, or inflexible or inflexible quality or character. Preeminent, preeminent, eminent above or before others. Superior, surpassing. For example, he is preeminent in his profession. Per se, per se, by, of, for, or in itself, intrinsically. For example, this candidate is not a pacifist per se, but he is in favor of peaceful solutions when practicable. Succinct, succinct, expressed in few words, concise, terse. Apparatus, apparatus, a group of combination of instruments, machinery, tools, materials, etc., having a particular function or indeed for a specific use. For example, our town has excellent firefighting apparatus. Tacit, tacit, understood without being openly expressed, implied. For example, tacit approval. Paradox, paradox, a statement or proposition that seems self-contradictory or absurd, but in reality expresses a possible truth. Rigorous, severely exact or accurate, precise. For example, rigorous research. Piecemeal, piecemeal, piece by piece, one piece at a time, gradually. For example, to work piecemeal. Layout, layout, an arrangement or plan. For example, we objected to the layout of the house. Cognate, cognate, a cognate word. The English word cold is a cognate of German called. Exemplify, exemplify, to show or illustrate by example. Obscure, obscure, to conceal or conceal by confusing the meaning of a statement, poem, etc. After you have reviewed all the necessary vocabulary related to our ESP lessons, now let's continue to the introduction of ESP. To travel hopefully is a better thing than to arrive, and the true success is to labor. This is according to Robert Louis Stevenson. The city of ELT. Once upon a time, there was a city called ELT. The people of ELT led a comfortable, if not extravagant, life pursuing the noble goals of literature and grammar. There were differences, of course. Some people preferred to call themselves EFL people, while others belonged to a group known as ESL. But the two groups lived in easy tolerance of each other, more united than disunited. Now, it happened that the city was surrounded by high mountains, and legend had it that the land beyond the mountains was inhabited by illiterate and savage tribes called scientists, businessmen, and engineers. Few people from ELT had ever ventured into that land. Then things began to change. Some of the people in ELT became restless. The old city could not support its growing population, and eventually some brave souls set off to seek their fortune in the land beyond the mountains. Many in ELT were shocked at the prospect. It was surely no place for people brought up in the gentle landscape of English literature and language. But, as it turned out, the adventurers found a rich and fertile land. They were welcomed by the local inhabitants and were founded a new city, which they called ESP. The city flourished and prospered as more and more settlers came. Soon, there were whole new settlements in this previously uncharted land. EST and EVE were quickly followed by EAP and EOP, the latter confusingly also known as EVP and VESL. Other smaller groups took on the names of the local tribes to found a host of new towns called English for hotel staff, English for marine engineers, English for medical science, and so on. A future of limitless expansion and prosperity looked assured. But as with all things, the reality proved less rosy. A number of people at the frontiers were forced to abandon their settlements and return to the larger cities. Many settlers who had come to the newly developed land because ELT could no longer provide them with a living longed for the comforts and certainties of the old city. Others were confused as to where their loyalties lay. Were they still citizens of ELT? Was EAP an independent city or a suburb of ESP? Did the people of English for medical science owe allegiance to EAP, EOP, or ESP? Worst of all, there were even examples of groups from ELT being transported against their will to the new territories. Added to all this, the scientists, businessmen, and other tribes were becoming more demanding. Some began to resent the interference of the settlers in the area. Others complained that the promised benefits had not materialized. The future in short began to look, if not gloomy, then a little confused and uncertain for the brave new world of ESP. Which brings us to this book. It will, we hope, serve as a guide to all present and future inhabitants of ESP, revealing both the challenges and pleasures to be enjoyed there and the pitfalls to be avoided. But first, let us take a moment to explain the title we have given to the book. For in doing so, we will not only explain our reasons for writing it, but will also be able to present a plan of the itinerary we shall follow. What then is a learning-centered approach to ESP? ESP, like any form of language teaching, is primarily concerned with learning, but it is our view that in its development up to now, ESP has paid scant attention to the question of how people learn, focusing instead on the question of what people learn. It has, in other words, been language-centered in its approach. We would not wish to dismiss this language-centered approach. It has provided some very important insights into the nature of specific language needs. However, we feel that if it is to have any real and lasting value, ESP must be founded in the first view that we have proposed a learning-centered approach to ESP. In the following pages, we shall explain what this shift in focus entails for the ESP practitioner. The book is divided into 4 sections. Section 1 is an overview of the origins and development of ESP and considers the question of how ESP fits into the general landscape of English language teaching. Section 2 looks at the basic principles and techniques in course design. How, in other words, do you create a course to fit the needs of a particular group of learners? Section 3 is concerned with the practical applications of the course design in the form of syllabus, materials, methodology, and assessment. Put briefly, having completed your course design, what do you do with it? Section 4 considers the role of the ESP teacher and provides information about resources to help the teacher. The book is intended to be very much a practical guide, and to this end, we have supplied a number of tasks at the end of each chapter. These are to get you thinking about the issues that are raised in that section, and in particular, to help you relate our necessarily general points to your own specific situation. If you are concerned with teacher training, these tasks may also be useful as workshop or seminar activities. Although they are placed at the end of the chapter, they can often be more valuable if done before reading the chapter itself. Your guide, route and mode of travel presented, it remains only to wish you an interesting and enjoyable journey. Okay, so here is the outline of a learning-centered approach to ESP. Let's start from the top. Section 1, what is ESP? Section 2, course design. Section 3, application. Section 4, the teacher. Section 1. What is ESP? ESP is based on designing courses to meet learners' needs. What does course design involve? So it involves the ways of describing language, models of learning, needs analysis, approaches to course design. How do you use a course design? So this is about the application. How do you use a course design? So this is how. Syllabus design, materials evaluation, materials design, methodology. These are all the evaluation. Section for the teacher. What is the role of the ESP teacher? There are two main roles. These are orientation and resources. Section 1. What is ESP? Particulars are not to be examined till the whole has been surveyed. This is according to the Samuel Johnson, the preface to Shakespeare. Our concern in this section is to arrive at a workable definition of ESP. But rather than give a straight answer now to the question, what is ESP? We would prefer to let it gradually emerge as we work through the section. Let us begin instead with a simpler question. Why ESP? After all, the English language world got along well enough without it for many years, so why has ESP become such an important, some might say the most important, part of English language teaching? In the following 3 chapters, we shall briefly survey the factors which led to the emergence of ESP in the late 1960s and the forces, both theoretical and practical, which have shaped its subsequent development. In Section 2, we shall look in greater detail at the elements we outline in this section. It is our intention here only to establish the background for the concepts and procedures we wish to present in this book. For a thorough and detailed explanation of the development of ideas and practices in ESP, we would recommend episodes in ESP by John Swales. 1. The origins of ESP. We will now discuss in a little more detail the struggle for existence. This is, according to Charles Darwin, the origins of species. As with most developments in human activity, ESP was not a planned and coherent movement, but rather a phenomenon that grew out of a number of converging trends. These trends have operated in a variety of ways around the world, but we can identify 3 main reasons common to the emergence of all ESP. 1. The demands of a brave new world. The end of the Second World War in 1945 heralded an age of enormous and unprecedented expansion in scientific, technical, and economical activity on an international scale. This expansion created a world unified and dominated by 2 forces, technology and commerce, which, in their relentless progress, soon generated a demand for an international language. For various reasons, most notably the economic power of the United States in the post-war world, this role fell to English. The effect was to create a whole new mass of people wanting to learn English, not for the pleasure or prestige of knowing the language, but because English was the key to the international currencies of technology and commerce. Previously, the reasons for learning English or any other language had not been well defined. Knowledge of foreign language had been generally regarded as a sign of a well-rounded education, but few had really questioned why it was necessary. Learning a language was, so to speak, its own justification, but as English became the accepted international language of technology and commerce, it created a new generation of learners who knew specifically why they were learning a language. Businessmen and businesswomen who wanted to sell their products, mechanics who had to read instruction manuals, doctors who needed to keep up with developments in their field, and a whole range of students whose course of study included textbooks and journals only available in English. All these and many others needed English, and most importantly, they knew why they needed it. This development was accelerated by the oil crisis of the early 1970s, which resulted in a massive flow of funds and Western expertise into the oil-rich countries. English suddenly became big business, and commercial pressures began to exert an influence. Time and money constraints created a need for cost-effective courses with clearly defined goals. The general effect of all this development was to exert pressure on the language teaching profession to deliver the required goals. Whereas English had previously decided its own destiny, it now became subject to the wishes, needs, and demands of people other than language teachers. English had become accountable to the scrutiny of the wider world, and the traditional leisurely and purpose-free stroll through the landscape of the English language seemed no longer appropriate in the harsher realities of the marketplace. 2. A revolution in linguistics. At the same time, the demand was growing for English courses tailored to specific needs. Influential new ideas began to emerge in the study of language. Traditionally, the aim of linguistics had been to describe the rules of English usage, that is, the grammar. However, the new studies shifted attention away from defining the formal features of language usage to discovering the ways in which language is actually used in real communication. Widdowson, 1978. One finding of this research was that the language we speak and write varies considerably and in a number of different ways from one context to another. In English language teaching, this gave rise to the view that there are important differences between, say, the English of commerce and that of engineering. These ideas married up naturally with the development of English courses for specific groups of learners. The idea was simple. If language varies from one situation of use to another, it should be possible to determine the features of specific situations and then make these features the basis of the learner's course. Swales, 1985, presents an article by C.L. Barber on the nature of scientific English, which was published as early as 1962, but it was the late 1960s and early 1970s which saw the greatest expansion of research into the nature of particular varieties of English. For example, descriptions of written scientific and technical English by Eva and Latoury, 1969, Swales, 1971, Selinker and Trimble, 1976, and others. Most of the work at this time was in the area of English for Science and Technology, EST, and for a time, ESP and EST were regarded as almost synonymous, but there were studies in other fields too, such as the analysis of doctor-patient communication by Kathleen Bruton and Leather, 1976. In short, the view gained ground that the English needed by a particular group of learners could be identified by analyzing the linguistic characteristics of their specialist area of work or study. Tell me what you need English for, and I will tell you the English that you need, became the guiding principle of ESP. 3. Focus on the learner. New developments in educational psychology also contributed to the rise of ESP. By emphasizing the central importance of the learners and their attitudes to learning, example, Rogers, 1969, learners were seen to have different needs and interests, which would have an important influence on their motivation to learn and therefore on the effectiveness of their learning. This lends part to the development of courses in which relevance to the learner's needs and interests was paramount. The standard way of achieving this was to take tests from the learner's specialist area. Tests about biology, for biology students, etc. The assumption underlying this approach was that the clear relevance of the English course to their needs would improve the learner's motivation and thereby make learning better and faster. The growth of ESP then was brought about by a combination of three important factors: the expansion of demand for English to suit particular needs, and developments in the fields of linguistics and educational psychology. All three factors seemed to point towards the need for increased specialization in language learning. 2. The development of ESP. The best laid schemes of mice and men, Gareth R. Lee, Robert Burns. From its early beginnings in the 1960s, ESP has undergone three main phases of development. It is now a fourth phase, with a fifth phase starting to emerge. We shall describe each of the five phases in greater detail in later chapters, but it will provide a useful perspective to give a brief summary here. It should be pointed out, first of all, that ESP is not a monolithic, universal phenomenon. ESP has developed at different speeds in different countries, and examples of all the approaches we shall describe can be found operating somewhere in the world at the present time. Our summary must therefore be very general in its focus. It will be noticeable in the following overview that one area of activity has been particularly important in the development of ESP. This is the area usually known as EST, English for Science and Technology. Swell's 1985, in fact, uses the development of EST to illustrate the development of ESP in general. With one or two exceptions, English for Science and Technology has always set and continues to set the trend in theoretical discussion, in ways of analyzing language, and in the variety of actual teaching materials. We have not restricted our own illustrations to EST in this book, but we will need to acknowledge, as well as does, the preeminent position of EST in the ESP story. 1. The concept of spatial language register analysis. This stage took place mainly in the 1960s and early 1970s and was associated in particular with the work of Peter Stephens, Hollidays, McIntosh, and Stephens, 1964, Jack Ever and Latore, 1969, and John Swells, 1971. Operating on the basic principle that the English of, say, electrical engineering constituted a specific register different from that of, say, biology or of general English. The aim of the analysis was to identify the grammatical and lexical features of these registers. Teaching materials then took these linguistic features as their syllabus. A good example of such a syllabus is that of a course in basic scientific English by Ever and Latore, 1969. In fact, as Ever and Latore's syllabus shows, register analysis revealed that there was very little that was distinctive in the sentence grammar of scientific English beyond a tendency to favor particular forms such as the present simple tense, the passive voice, and nominal compounds. It did not, for example, reveal any forms that were not found in general English. But we must be wary of making unfair criticism. Although there was an academic interest in the nature of registers of English per se, the main motive behind register analysis, such as Ever and Latore's, was the pedagogic one of making the ESP course more relevant to learners' needs. The aim was to produce a syllabus which gave high priority to the language forms students would meet in their science studies, and in turn would give low priority to forms they would not meet. Ever and Hobbes Davies, 1971, for example, compared the language of the text their science students had to read with the language of some widely used school textbooks. They found that the school textbooks neglected some of the language forms commonly found in science text. For example, compound nouns, passives, conditionals, and anomalous, finite, or modal verbs. Their conclusion was that the ESP course should therefore give precedence to these forms. Beyond the sentence, rhetorical discourse analysis. There were, as we shall see, serious flaws in the register analysis-based syllabus, but as it happened, register analysis as a research procedure was rapidly overtaken by developments in the world of linguistics. Whereas in the first stage of its development, ESP had focused on language at the sentence level, and the second phase of development shifted attention to the level above the sentence. As ESP became closely involved with the emerging field of discourse or rhetorical analysis, the leading lies is in this movement. In this movement were Henry Widdowson in the Britain and the so-called Washington School of Larry Selinker, Louis Trimble, John Langston, and Mary Todd Trimble in the United States. The basic hypothesis of this stage is succinctly expressed by Allen and Widdowson in 1974. We take the view that the difficulties which the students encounter arise not so much from a detective knowledge of the system of English, but from an unfamiliarity with English use, and that consequently their needs cannot be met by a course which simply provides further practice in the composition of sentences, but only by one which develops a knowledge of how sentences are used in the performance of different communicative acts. Register analysis had focused on sentence grammar, but now attention is shifted to understanding how sentences were combined in discourse to produce meaning. The concern of research, therefore, was to identify the organizational patterns in text and to specify the linguistic means by which these patterns are signaled. These patterns would then form the syllabus of the ESP course. The rhetorical process chart below from EST, a discourse approach by Louis Trimble, 1985, is representative of this approach. So these are the rhetorical process chart. As in stage 1, there was a more or less tacit assumption in this approach that the rhetorical patterns of text organization differed significantly between specialist areas of use. The rhetorical structure of sentence text was regarded as different from that of commercial text, for example. However, at this point was never very clearly examined. See Wells, 1985, page 70. And indeed, paradoxically, the results of the research into the discourse of subject-specific academic text were also used to make observations about discourse in general. Widdowson, 1978. The typical teaching materials based on the discourse approach taught students to recognize textual patterns and discourse markers, mainly by means of text diagramming exercises. The English in Focus series, or UP, is a good example of this approach. 3. Target situation analysis. The stage that we come to consider now did not really add anything new to the range of knowledge about ESP. What it aimed to do was to take the existing knowledge and set it on a more specific scientific basis by establishing procedures for relating language analysis more closely to learners' reasons for learning. Given that the purpose of an ESP course is to enable learners to function adequately in a target situation, that is, the situation in which the learners will use the language they are learning, then the ESP course design process should proceed by first identifying the target situation and then carrying out a rigorous analysis of the linguistic features of that situation. The identified features will form the syllabus of the ESP course. This process is usually known as needs analysis. However, we prefer to take Chambers' 1980 term of target situation analysis, since it is a more accurate description of the process concerned. The most thought-of explanation of target situation analysis is the system set out by John Munby in Communicative Syllabus Design, 1978. The Munby model produces a detailed profile of the learner's needs in terms of communication purposes, communicative setting, the means of communication, language skills, functions, structures, etc. The target situation analysis stage marked a certain coming of age for ESP. What had previously been done very much in a piecemeal way was now systematized, and learner need was apparently placed at the center of the course design process. It proved in the event to be a false dawn. As we shall see in the following chapters, the concept of needs that it was based on was far too simple. 4. Skills and strategies. We noted that in the first two stages of the development of ESP, all the analysis had been of the surface forms of the language. Whether at sentence level as in register analysis or above, or as in discourse analysis, the target situation analysis approach did not really change this, because in its analysis of learner need, it still looked mainly at the surface. linguistic features of the target situation. The fourth stage of ESP has seen an attempt to look below the surface and to consider not the language itself but the thinking processes that underlie language use. There is no dominant feature in the movement, although we might mention the work of François Grillet, 1981, Christine Nuttall, 1982, and Charles Alderson and Sandy Guha, 1984, as having made significant contributions to work on reading skills. Most of the work in the area of skills and strategies, however, has been done close to the ground in schemes such as the National ESP project in Brazil and the University of Malaysia ESP project. CELT documents 107 and Skills for Learning published by Nelson and the University of Malaya Press. Both these projects were set up to cope with study situations where the medium of instruction is the mother tongue, but students need to read a number of specialist texts which are available only in English. The projects have therefore concentrated their efforts on reading strategies. The principal idea behind the skills-centered approach is that underlying all language use, there are common reasoning and interpreting processes which, regardless of the surface forms, enable us to extract meaning from discourse. There is, therefore, no need to focus closely on the surface forms of the language. The focus should rather be on the underlying interpretive strategies which enable the learner to cope with the surface forms, for example, guessing the meaning of words from context, using visual layout to determine the type of text, exploiting cognates, words which are similar in the mother tongue and the target language. A focus on specific subject registers is unnecessary in this approach, because the underlying processes are not specific to any subject register. It was argued that reading skills are not language specific but universal, and that there is the core of English language, for example, certain structures of argument and forms of presentation, which can be identified as academic and which is not subject specific. It is interesting to note, however, that not all such projects have such a focus. The ESP project at King Mongkut's Institute of Technology in Bangkok, Thailand, for example, has to cope with a very similar study situation, but the focus here is on the full range of skills: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. As has been noted in terms of materials, and this approach generally puts the emphasis on reading or listening strategies. The characteristic exercises get the learners to reflect on and analyze how meaning is produced in and retrieved from written or spoken discourse, taking their cue from cognitive learning theories. The language learners are treated as thinking beings who can be asked to observe and verbalize the interpretive processes they enjoy in language use. Five, a learning-centered approach. In outlining the origins of ESP, we identified three forces which we might characterize as new ideas about language and new ideas about learning. It should have become clear that in its subsequent development, however, scant attention has been paid to the last of these forces, learning. All of the stages outlined so far have been fundamentally flawed in that they are all based on descriptions of language use. Whether this description is of surface forms, as in the case of register analysis, or of underlying processes, as in the skills and stages approach, the concern in each case is with describing what people do with language. But our concern in ESP is not with language use. Although this will help to define the course objectives, our concern is with language learning. We cannot simply assume that describing and exemplifying what people do with language will enable someone to learn it. If that were so, we would need to do no more than read a grammar book and a dictionary in order to learn a language. A truly valid approach to ESP must be based on an understanding of the processes of language learning. This brings us to the fifth stage of ESP development, the learning-centered approach, which will form the subject of this book. The importance and the implications of the distinction that we have made between language use and language learning will hopefully become clear as we proceed through the following chapters. ESP approach, not product. Beware that you do not lose the substance by grasping at the shadow. The fable of dark and the shadow. The survey above shows that in its relatively brief history, there have been several major shifts in the development of ESP, both in theory and practice. However, we have tried to show that in spite of their differences, the successive stages have all concentrated on the linguistic aspect of ESP. They are all essentially language-centered approaches. In later chapters, we shall look in greater detail at how this has shaped the way in which people see ESP. For now, let us return to the question posed at the beginning of this section: what is ESP? To answer this question fully, we need first of all to establish a context which will help us to see how ESP at the present time relates to the rest of ELT. What exactly is the status of the citizens of ESP and its satellite settlements in relation to the general world of ELT? In the time-honored manner of linguistics, we shall represent the relationship in the form of a tree. The tree represents some of the common divisions that are made in ELT. The topmost branches of the tree show the level at which individual ESP's courses occur. The branches just below this level indicate that these may conveniently be divided into two main types of ESP, differentiated according to whether the learner requires English for academic study, EAP, English for academic purposes, or for work, training, EOP, EVP, VESL, English for occupational purposes, English for vocational purposes, vocational English as a second language. This is, of course, not a clear-cut distinction. People can work and study simultaneously. It is also likely that in many cases, the language learned for immediate use in a study environment will be used later when the student takes up or returns to a job. At the next level down, it is possible to distinguish ESP courses by the general nature of the learner's specialism. Three large categories are usually identified here: EST, English for Science and Technology; EEB, English for Business and Economics; and ESS, English for the Social and Sciences. This last is not common, probably because it is not taught. So now let's start from the root of the tree of ELT. The root is learning and communication. The trunk is language teaching. Yeah. And the branch are English language teaching, ELT, and English as a mother tongue, EMT, and English as a foreign language, EFL, and English as a second language, ESL. ESL can be divided in the same way as EFL, and there are General English, GE, various branches, and GE is usually studied for exam purposes. English for scientific purposes, ESP. Secondary, US high school. Primary school, secondary US high school, adult tertiary. English for science and technology, EST. English for business and economics, EBE. English for social sciences, ESS. EOP is also known as EVB, English for vocational purposes, and VESL, vocational English as a second language. English for academic purposes, EAP. English for occupational purposes, EOP. EAP, EOP. EAP courses often have a study skills component. EAP, EOP. English for medical studies, English for technicians, English for economics, English for secretaries, English for psychology, English for teaching. So these are the summary of the ELT tree. Okay, so let's go back. This last is not common, probably because it is not thought to differ significantly from more traditional humanities-based general English. As we go down the tree, we can see that ESP is just one branch of EFL, ESL, which are themselves the main branches of English language teaching in general. ELT, in turn, is one variety of the many possible kinds of language teaching. But, of course, there is more to a tree than a visible above ground. A tree cannot survive without roots. The roots which nourish the tree of ELT are communicative and learning. The analogy of a tree can help us to get a bit closer to a definition of ESP. not so much by showing what ESP is, but rather by showing what ESP isn't. A. ESP is not a matter of teaching specialized varieties of English. The fact that language is used for a specific purpose does not imply that it is a special form of the language, different in kind from other forms. Certainly, there are some features which can be identified as typical of a particular context of use and which therefore the learner is more likely to meet in the target situation. But these differences should not be allowed to obscure the far target area of common ground that underlies all English use and indeed all language use. ESP is not just a matter of science word and grammar for scientists, hotel words and grammar for hotel staff, and so on. When we look at a tree, we see the leaves and branches, but there is much more to the tree than just this. Much of it hidden from view inside and beneath the tree. The leaves do not just hang in the air. They are supported by a complex underlying structure. In the same way, there is much more to communication than just the surface features that we read and hear. We need to distinguish, as Chomsky did with regard to grammar, between performance and competence. That is, between what people actually do with the language and the range of knowledge and abilities which enables them to do it. Hutchinson and Waters, 1981. ESP is not different in kind from any other form of language teaching, in that it should be based on the first instance on principles of effective and efficient learning. Though the content of learning may vary, there is no reason to suppose that the processes of learning should be any different for the ESP learner than for the general English learner. There is, in other words, no such thing as an ESP methodology, merely methodologies that have been applied in ESP classrooms, but could just as well have been used in the learning of any kind of English. So, what is ESP? Having stressed the commonality of language and learning, how does ESP differ from other forms of ELT? To answer this, ESP must be seen as an approach, not as a product. ESP is not a particular kind of language or methodology, nor does it consist of a particular type of teaching material. Understood properly, it is an approach to language learning, which is based on learner need. The foundation of all ESP is the simple question: why does this learner need to learn a foreign language? From this question will flow a whole host of further questions, some of which will relate to the learners themselves, some to the nature of the language the learners will need to operate, some to the given learning context. But this whole analysis derives from an initial identified need in the part of the learner to learn the language. ESP, then, is an approach to language teaching in which all decisions as to content and method are based on the learner's reason for learning. Conclusion. In this section, we have identified the main factors in the origins of ESP and given a brief overview of its development. We have noted that the linguistic factor has tended to dominate this development with an emphasis on the analysis of the nature of specific varieties of language use. Probably this has been a necessary stage, but now there is a need for a wider view that focuses less on differences and more on what various specialisms have in common. As the theory of ELT shows, what they have in common is that they are all primarily concerned with communication and learning. ESP should properly be seen not as any particular language product, but as an approach to language teaching, which is directed by specific and apparent reasons for learning. So that is all about our section. Very long session, and it is very long time. And thank you for your attention, everyone, and I will try to make another video of this for you to learn by heart. Yeah, okay. If you like, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much.